And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Percy Shelley's famous poem Ozymandias captures, in my opinion, the essence of the power, glory, and fleeting vanity of the political sentiments of the 19th century Romantics. While the Bible and classical sources testified to the vanity of fleeting power and glory, the Romantics resurrected this wisdom in an age of haughty power, glory, and egoism, with a corresponding pomp, vanity, and egoism of their own, which ultimately proves ironic, all things considered. Understanding Romanticism is difficult because of the multifaceted avenues it influenced in culture and life. Isaiah Berlin, in his series of lectures on Romanticism given back in 1964, remarked that Romanticism simultaneously influenced both reactionary movements as much as radical and progressive ones. If, however, we are to agree upon one common thread of Romanticism, it would have to be the unbridled passion, pathology, that undergirded it, as Romanticism rebelled against the sterile and suffocating tyranny of mechanical rationalism and materialism, which had risen to prominence in the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Some have taken to calling the Romantic Revolution not so much the Counter-Enlightenment as it was the Age of Passion. The Age of Passion, to my mind, is apt. One cannot help but feel the passionate blood coursing through their own veins and off their lips as they read the words of proto-romantics like Milton and Alexander Pope, and the works of the canonical romantics like Lord Byron, John Keats, or Shelley. And it is these figures whom I would like to briefly discuss within the realm of passionate politics, power, glory, and vanity, which move their poems. That the Romantics would preoccupy themselves with politics shouldn't be surprising to us. After all, they lived in an age of intense, passionate politics and conflagration. Byron, Keats, and Shelley all matured and lived in the throes of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, unsurprisingly, is a figure whose echoes and shadows can be heard and traced in their poetry, explicitly as well as implicitly. From the storming of the Bastille up to the Battle of Waterloo, the explosive triumph of the will stirred the hearts and passions of men and women in Europe, and even across the sea in America. It was also an age of exploration, excavation, and desecration. All these themes meet in Romantic poetry in their unique and explosive ways. It would seem odd, then, that the Romantic political poetry draws on the imagery and consciousness of antiquity rather than the nascent modernity that they were all living through. But Romantic poetry, using the veil and imagery and language of antiquity, is making commentary on the present. The haughty tyrants of Europe were, in the imagination of the Romantics, akin to the cruel and vindictive kings of the past: Nebuchadnezzar, Ozymandias, who we know as Ramses II, and Sennacherib. Keats, if I am permitted to say, even though I do love him, is the least of the three poets, the other two being Byron and Shelley here, insofar that his language conveys the point in an otherwise simply straightforward way. He lacks the imaginative flair of Byron and Shelley, but still underscores the main point of pride, coming before the fall. And who can forget, among the biblically literate, the pride and fall of Nebuchadnezzar, from towering conqueror and tyrant to bestial animal, roaming with the cattle and grazing on the ground. As Keats himself writes, "Before he went to live with owls and bats, Nebuchadnezzar had an ugly dream, worse than a housewife's, when she thinks her cream made a namachia for mice and rats, so scared he sent for that good kind of cats. Young Daniel, who did straightway pluck the beam from out of his eye, and said, I do not deem your scepter worth a straw, your cushions old door mats. A horrid nightmare, similar somewhat, of late has haunted a most valiant crew of loggerheads and chapmen. We are told that any Daniel, though he be a sot, can make their lying lips turn pale of hue by drawing out, Ye are that head of gold. Keats here no doubt wishes himself to be the imaginative radical prophet Daniel of his own fancy, part of the romantic imagination of the poet-prophet, being more eternal and immortal than their political masters, who are, in fact, puppets to the poets and the prophets, who are the true masters of the world. Daniel, like the poet Keats himself, an opponent of absolutism, reminds the pride and pomp of Nebuchadnezzar, the metaphor in this poem for the European kings and aristocrats of his own time, that their scepter is only worth a straw, and their cushions old door mats. As a poet, Keats here is mocking the pride and power of the vain kings of Europe, through the imagination and the reimagination of this encounter between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Keats is speaking through Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar is simply the in situ poetic representation of the European tyrants of Keats's day. As Daniel, Keats is telling the unworthy kings of the world, again represented by Nebuchadnezzar, of their coming fall, which horrifies them. Truly, this prophecy of coming demise is an ugly dream, a horrid nightmare. Here, Keats also relishes the fact that the poet is like the prophet, interpreting dreams and visions with intense political overtures, still relevant in our time as it was in ancient times. Power, glory, wealth, all is fleeting, all is vanity, since it will all come tumbling down like the walls of Jericho. The straightforwardness of Keats's political romanticism reaches fuller maturation in Byron and Shelley, and certainly more imaginatively so in these two poets. There is a lack of life, no life force, to Keats's ostentatiously political poems. He simply speaks it as it is. Byron's political poetry, however, draws on ancient language, imagery, and metaphor, creating a vibrant world by contrast, which explodes to life before collapsing into death by the greater power of the angel of death and the hand of God. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that hosts with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostril all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow, and the rust on his mail, and the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. While Byron is undeniably playing on the same themes of haughty power and pride as Keats, being called by a pertinent justice, a perhaps even sublime and transcendent justice, Byron brings, as you could have heard in my recitation of this section of one of his poems, a grander flair to his writings as the poem literally moves with the imagery of wind, life, and movement before dissipating and dissolving into defeat, death, and the lack of movement. The poem opens with power and majesty, temporal to be sure, on full display, a grandiose movement of terrestrial power and life. The Assyrians came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. The power and majesty of the powerful Assyrian king, in this instance Sennacherib, and his army, however, rapidly dissolves into death, destruction, and defeat as the course of the poem unfolds. And there lay the rider distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail, and the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. In a grand waltz of poetic successions and contrasts, the mighty power of Assyria pales in comparison to the greater power and majesty of the angel of death, sent by the Lord to deliver Jerusalem from destruction. The once rapturous and awesome sight of banners and men and spears glistening in the sun and the stars as they move down the hills and valley is suddenly stalled into a lifeless death, everything now unlifted, as the wind howls through the camp and flaps the empty tents, with only the echoing of flapping fabric filling the ear of the earth. The height of pride and power is shown to be vain. All power and glory, as Byron shows here, is fleeting. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Galilee, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. The power of Sennacherib and his mighty army is nothing compared to the power of the Lord on high. Lords and ladies of temporal polities, beware. Challenge the awesome power and justice of the Lord, if you dare. The arrogance of the kings of old and the vanity of their passion and pride is also set up for the chopping block by Percy Shelley. Like Byron, Shelley's Ozymandias opens with action and movement, but reminds us of age and antiquity, and therefore ultimately decadence and decrepitness. But unlike Byron, who crushes the arrogance of tyrannical kings with a lifeless camp, lacking movement, Shelley keeps movement alive through the cycle of time and its bearing down, withering away of the vanity of kings, a reflection of Shelley's naturalism. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away." What Shelley does so remarkably in this poem, upon close examination, is how it begins with a sense of urgency, movement, and life. We meet a traveler from an antique land who bears supposed age and knowledge to the poetic pilgrim. But we soon learn that the amazing colossus that the ancient traveler has seen is shattered and lifeless. And to make it more haunting, the ultimate revelation of this decayed statue is laid bare to us only in the ultimate invocation of arrogance and pride on the part of the patron and benefactor. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Only after Ozymandias boasts like an infantile tyrant do we learn what remains of that colossal wreck that was boundless and bare, stretching far away through the sands of time. The arrogance of Ozymandias moves with the world into the imbalance of decay. Nothing is permanent. Decadence and destruction follow from this decay wrought by tyrannical arrogance. Destruction, Shelley reminds us, naturally follows such haughty proclamations of naked vanity as we just met moments earlier. Yet the movement of nature, the eternality of lifeless things, persists. Ozymandias is dead, but the lifeless stones which bear his legacy, decayed as they are, remain without him, mocked by the eternality of the poet as he laughs at the pretensions of a failed king. Additionally, the lone and level sands, stretching far away, reflect the naturalism of this movement. Befitting Shelley's atheism in comparison to Byron's quixotic and despairing psychological Calvinism, the power of man is nothing compared to the power of nature. And again, this is important in understanding the contrast between Shelley and Byron. Byron places the nothingness of man compared to the power of God and the angel of death. Shelley places the nothingness of man in comparison to the power of nature. For it is nature that is still here, those lone and level sands stretching far away, while the power and haughtiness of Ozymandias is gone forever. But the allegories and metaphors of contemporary politics, veiled by the imagery and consciousness of antiquity, is not the only commonality among the Romantics. Given that Keats, Byron, and Shelley lived during the turbulence and exhilaration of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, it is only fitting, as already mentioned, that Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, and Europe's titanic struggle against a new Sennacherib, or Ozymandias, even if the poets themselves had awkward affinities to the French emperor, eventually brings forth this new realization of the haughtiness of power and its ultimate impermanence in the world, despite the attempt to build something permanent out of the power that comes from pride. Keats, again, is the most modest of the poets, writing about the shocking and sudden fall of Napoleon in 1814, who in just a couple years earlier had seemed at the very height of his power. Napoleon goes unnamed, but the poem On Peace echoes with the footsteps and shadow of Napoleon everywhere. O peace, and dost thou with thy presence bless the dwellings of this war-surrounded isle, soothing with placid brow our late distress, making the triple kingdom brightly smile. Joyful I hail thy presence, and I hail the sweet companions that await on thee. Complete my joy, let not my first wish fail. Let the sweet mountain nymph thy favorite be, with England's happiness proclaim Europa's liberty. O Europe, let not sceptred tyrants see that thou must shelter in thy former state. Keep thy chains burst, and boldly thou art free. Give thy king's law leave, not uncurbed the great. So with the horrors past, thou'lt win thy happier fate. While Keats is genuinely happy for the arrival of peace, again you can hear it in his own language, joyful I hail thy presence, and I hail the sweet companions that await on thee, he is also hopeful for a continuation of reformist radicalism to sweep the cornerstones of old Europe, those former states being moved by that ultimate good that came from Napoleon, reform, greater political freedom, before being smashed both by Napoleon's turn to tyranny, as well as the aristocratic monarchies of Europe, allying against the revolution. Let not sceptred tyrants see that thou must shelter in thy former state. Keep thy chains burst, and boldly say thou art free. Keats desires to see a Europe free of the absolutist change which currently ensnare it. He desires constitutional systems where laws constrain the great and provide the happier fate of the citizenry. In between the lines, we still learn much about Keats in this particular sonnet. He wants the powerful and proud to be curtailed, whether Napoleon or the current kings of Europe. He wants the common citizenry to burst out of the absolutist chains that drag them down. Though it has the veil of modesty and reform, Keats desires nothing less than the powerful and prideful to be knocked down off their pedestals, just like Nebuchadnezzar in his earlier poem. The emancipatory impulse is what drives this desire to see the proud and powerful broken. Keats is a poet of romantic emancipation. Byron and Shelley also joined the fray of Napoleonic eulogies. What makes Byron and Shelley unique in this enterprise is that theirs is an undercurrent of adoration to their poems that nonetheless end with that proverbial wisdom that all power and glory is ultimately fleeting. Action, movement, is the great hallmark of power and greatness, as Shelley subtly informs us in To the Emperors of Russia and Austria in his imaginative poetic lecture on the Battle of Austerlitz. The coward chiefs of Russia and Austria remain calm and still on the heights as the torrential bloodbath ensues below, where real patriots fight and die. Napoleon, by contrast, is the man of action, the restless fiend who haunts the tumult of yon gory field, whom neither shame nor danger daunts, who dares not fear, who cannot yield. Will not the equalizing blow exalt the high, abase the low, and in one mighty shock o'erthrow the slaves that scepters wield? Cowardly tyrants sit aloft while men of greatness get into the thick of it. But on the death of Napoleon, Shelley was overcome to offer his eulogy to the great shaker and mover of world history. While others mocked and punned the French emperor, Shelley took it upon himself to offer a stirring eulogy that is, nevertheless, still filled with irony, given that grandeur and greatness and glory, which all ends ultimately ignominiously. Shelley combines his two great themes, like an Ozymandias, the eternality and the supremacy of nature over the greatness of man, even a man as great as Napoleon. What, alive and so bold, O earth, art thou not overbold? What, leapest thou forth as of old in the light of thy morning mirth, the last of the flock of the starry fold? Ha! Leapest thou forth as of old? Are not the limbs still when the ghost is fled? And canst thou more Napoleon being dead? How is not thy quick heart cold? What spark is alive on thy hearth? How is it not his death knell knolled? And livest thou still, Mother Earth? Thou wert warming thy fingers old o'er the embers covered and cold of that most fiery spirit when it fled. What, mother, do you laugh now that he is dead? Shelley displays his own passionate arrogance in conversing with Mother Earth, who berates the poet and Napoleon in response. Who has known me of old, replied Earth, or who has my story told? It is thou who art overbold. And the lightning of scorn laughed forth, and she sung, To my bosom I fold all my sons when their knell is knolled, and so with living motion all are fed, and the quick spring like weeds out of the dead. Still alive and still bold, shouted earth, I grow bolder and still more bold. The dead fill me 10,000-fold. Fuller of speed and splendor and mirth, I was cloudy and sullen and cold, like a frozen chaos uprolled, till by the spirit of the mighty dead my heart grew warm. I feed on whom I feed. I feed on whom I feed. Think about that for a while. That is an apt way to describe this mortal condition of man and the empty grandeur and greatness that accompanies him. The earth feeds on the poor and the rich, the haughty and the lame, the great and the insignificant. It mattered not how great and powerful Napoleon was. Like Ozymandias, nature's power is tenfold that of man. So it is that Napoleon, the scourge of Europe, the bringer of liberty and tyranny, depending on your partisanship, is swallowed up by the earth. His grandeur and greatness, whether in liberty or tyranny, but a ruin inside the stomach of that which consumes everything man has ever tried to achieve. In fitting tribute, Shelley still gives Napoleon a fierce and rolling spirit to indicate his greatness, even if it is ultimately consumed by the earth, as all glory has fled. Byron's Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte is, in my mind, the grandest of the eulogistic compositions to the French emperor, concerned with his fall from power offered by the English Romantics. Where Shelley has his own egotistical wrestling match with nature and loses, Byron captures the blood, terror, and ecstasy of political greatness and decadence all at once. There is spectacle and ego, ecstasy and victory, glory and vanity in this pursuit of power, and eternity among great men. Yet there is also the reality that grandeur is soon met by the fall. "'Tis done but yesterday a king, and armed with kings to strive, and now thou art a nameless thing, so abject yet alive. The triumph, the vanity, the rapture of the strife, the earthquake voice of victory, to thee the breath of life, the sword, the scepter, and the sway, which man seemed made but to obey, wherewith renown was rife, all quelled, dark spirit, what must be the madness of thy memory?" The opening stanzas of Byron's poetry proceeds paradoxically. The great movement, power, and vanity of Napoleon has become the movement of memory in Byron. The poem begins with the death and destruction of Napoleon, now but a nameless thing. But upon reflecting on that former greatness, that former power and pride, Byron provides the spectacle and ego of ecstasy and victory, the rapture of the strife which moves grandiosity to ascend to the stars. In continuing to reflect upon Napoleon, we meet the awesome wrestling of power against power, the fragility of the old coming up against the youthful intemperance of the new, freedom for all, and the destruction of the old. In this conflagration of old power and new power, youthful exuberance and aged fear, the intensity of the sublime is revealed in this struggle to the death. And earth had split her blood for him who thus can hoard his own, and monarchs bowed the trembling limb and thanked him for a throne. Fair freedom, we may hold thee dear, when thus thy mightiest foes their fear in humblest guise have shown. Oh, ne'er may a tyrant leave behind a brighter name to lure mankind. Thine evil deeds are writ in gore, nor written thus in vain. Thy triumphs tell of fame no more, or deepen every stain. If thou hadst died as honor dies, some new Napoleon might arise to shame the world again. But who would soar the solar heights to set such a starless night? What Byron does well in his eulogy concerning the fall of Napoleon is how greatness lives on in memory, even as battlefield triumphs and magnificent marble statues are no more. Great men come and go, their monuments decay and dissolve, but in that most blessed realm of memory, greatness endures in the imagination of the beholder. Yes, one the first, the last the best, the Cincinnatus of the West, whom envy dared not to hate, bequeathed the name of Washington to make man blush. There was but one. Power, glory, and vanity all intersect in the mesmerizing poetry of the Romantics. The rapturous strife that was the 1790s to the 1810s is captured in the very moment, movement, and closure of all the political poetry of the Romantics. We witness power, pride, and glory, but we also witness death, destruction, and the fleeting and feeble realities of power and pride. All decays, all withers away, all disappears. The Romantics, in their own egotistical ways, remind us of that ancient wisdom from antique lands far away, that all is vanity. From them we remember the decayed and desiccated ruins of fleeting politics, kings, queens, and tyrants, a forever memory of what politics ultimately always is.